What nonsense.
Question number 2, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Order. Order.
I've called the Honourable Leader of the Opposition and he has every right to ask his question. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Did he raise with the Minister for the Rugby World Cup the need to utilise the provision of the Rugby World Cup 2011 Empowering Act 2010 before the opening night? If not, why not?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, from time to time there were very informal discussions about under what circumstances the Act may be required to be used, but before this week there were no discussions about specific use of its powers.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, supplementary. In relation to the chaos in downtown Auckland and the debacle around the transport system, why wasn't the government, quote unquote, ahead of the game, as the Minister for the Rugby World Cup assured New Zealand that it was and promised that it would be?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, because we relied on the assurances given by, amongst others, Auckland Transport and those managing the downtown waterfront, that they had all contingencies covered.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, what does the Prime Minister say in response to this email by Jan Gillespie to him? Quote, "You're extremely lucky that there was no death or serious injury from crushing or trampling in Quay Street." And then further, "It was an extremely dangerous and scary situation to be in. If anyone had fallen, they would have been seriously trampled. There was no supervision in sight." Does he take any responsibility for that?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I don't think it would be right to say there was no supervision in sight, because I'm aware of, literally dozens and dozens of police that were dispatched to Quay Street. But what I would say is I actually agree with her that we cannot take that risk. That is why the Rugby World Cup Minister used his empowering, the empowering legislation to have a backup at Captain Cook, and that's why I think the government's taken the right course of action.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Does he accept any responsibility in this sense that the party central on Queen's Wharf was his idea, and it was at his insistence that the council focused on that instead of having diverse fan zones from around the city that would have prevented the crush of people that could not be properly contained and the disaster in the transport system and people trying to get there?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, just in the last question, the member said there was no crushing, but we were lucky. Now the member is claiming there is crushing. So the member really should get his question right before one of the Camp Davids takes over. Mr Speaker, but anyway, back onto the more serious point. Yeah, so Mr Speaker, the government has taken, I believe, the appropriate steps to ensure that it's in better place. In terms of Queen's Wharf, Queen's Wharf actually operated very effectively on Friday night. That was the bit that did work well because it was a controlled environment where there was access and it was co-managed by the government.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Question. What does the Prime Minister say to Jason and Cheryl, who said about this situation on the trains, and I'm quoting, Mr Speaker, "People were having trouble breathing due to lack of oxygen. People started to become concerned and agitated. Babies were crying. Elderly people were changing colour. Some needed water, some needed the toilet. Why does he blame them for pressing the emergency button instead of accepting responsibility for having the wrong venue and an inadequate transport system?"
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, it would depend on where they were on the train in relation to whether you could even claim it was the wrong venue. They may well have been going to the stadium, to Eden Park. Secondly, I'd invite the member and I'd invite those people who wrote the email to actually read the Auckland Transport report this afternoon when it is finally published, and just to see exactly where that blame might lie. They might find it quite interesting reading.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, given the promises that he and his ministers repeatedly made that everything would be right on the night, why did ministerial oversight fail?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, first thing, Mr. Speaker, actually a lot was right on the night. An awful lot was right on the night. And I know the member wants to create a misery of what was otherwise a great celebration for New Zealand, but on this side of the House we're not doing that. What is clear was there was an operational failure out of transport, an operational failure in the downtown part of the Quay Street in certain parts, and the government's working very hard to resolve those.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Given that events like Christmas in the Park have attracted hundreds of thousands of people, how many people did he expect to the free concert, the spectacular fireworks display, the waka display and the hype and excitement around the waterfront area?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, the advice we had from ATEED was 50,000. That advice was tested by the Rugby World Cup officials on at least one occasion, and they came back to say their advice was absolutely right and they stood by it. Supplementary question, the Honourable Rick Barker.
To the Prime Minister, who wrote the speech he gave at the opening of the Rugby World Cup?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
I did, and I wouldn't go so far as to say I wrote a speech. I'd say I created one.
Question number